The dust rose in thin columns across the Montana plateau as the old truck crawled down the gravel road toward grandfather's ranch. 8-year-old Marcus pressed his face against the window, watching the landscape shift from highway to wilderness, from noise to silence. His silence. The silence that had lived inside him since birth, that no doctor could explain and no therapy could break. In the front seat, his mother twisted a tissue between her fingers, while his father drove with jaw clenched, neither speaking. The divorce papers sat in a manila envelope on the dashboard, yellowed edges catching the late afternoon sun. They'd stopped talking to each other 3 months ago. Now they were delivering Marcus to a place neither of them wanted to visit, to a man they barely spoke to, because their lawyers said a neutral environment would be best during the proceedings. The ranch appeared through the heat shimmer like something out of time. Weathered barn, sagging fences, a house that had known better years. Grandfather stood on the porch, tall and bent like an old tree, his face carved by wind and disappointment. He raised one hand in greeting, but didn't smile. The goodbye was quick and painful. Marcus's mother kissed his forehead, whispered promises she wouldn't keep. His father gripped his shoulder once, hard, then released him like letting go of something that burned. The truck kicked up dust as it turned around, and Marcus watched it disappear down the road, carrying the last pieces of the family that was breaking apart around him. Grandfather looked down at him, with eyes that had seen too much and said too little. "You don't talk. I don't talk much either. We'll get along fine." The house smelled of old wood and older memories. Grandfather showed Marcus to a small room that had belonged to his father as a boy. The same faded curtains, the same iron bed frame, the same view of the pasture where something wild moved in the distance. Horses. But not like the ones Marcus had seen in books or on television. These were mustangs, 16 of them, moving together like a single organism, their coats dusty and their eyes wary. They had been rounded up from Bureau of Land Management land, Grandfather explained in his clipped way, sold cheap because nobody could train them, too wild to ride and too stubborn to sell. "Supposed to break them?" Grandfather said, staring out at the herd. "That was the plan, but they're not breaking, and I'm too old and too poor to keep feeding animals that serve no purpose." He didn't say what would happen to horses that served no purpose. He didn't need to. That night, Marcus lay in bed listening to sounds he'd never heard before. Coyotes in the distance, wind through the cottonwood trees, the occasional thunder of hooves as the mustangs ran circuits around the pasture, like prisoners testing the walls of their confinement. The sounds filled the spaces where his voice should have been, and for the first time in his life, Marcus didn't feel quite so alone in his silence. Dawn came cold and gray to the Montana plateau, and Marcus woke to find Grandfather already gone, out checking fence lines, the note on the kitchen table said, back by noon. The house felt emptier than any place Marcus had ever been, hollow in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of furniture or people. He ate cereal from a chipped bowl and drank water from a tap that coughed and sputtered, then pulled on the boots Grandfather had left by the door, too big but serviceable, and walked out into the morning. The mustangs watched him from across the pasture, 16 pairs of eyes tracking his movement with the wariness of creatures who had learned that humans meant ropes and whips and captivity. Marcus had no ropes, no whips, no voice to call to them or soothe them, just his own silence and the strange pull he felt toward these animals that nobody wanted. He climbed through the fence rails and stood in the pasture grass, morning dew soaking through his jeans. The lead stallion, a buckskin with a scar across his chest, snorted and pawed the ground. Warning, threat. The herd shifted behind him, ready to wheel and run. Marcus didn't move toward them. Instead, he lifted his arms slowly, palms out, and began to move in a way that had no name. Not quite dance, not quite sign language. Something his body understood that his mind couldn't explain. A language written in gesture and space and the careful choreography of approach and retreat. The horses watched. The stallion's ears flicked forward, reading this strange human who spoke without sound, who moved without aggression, who seemed to understand something fundamental about the grammar of their world. Marcus took 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, raised his left hand high, lowered his right, turned in a slow circle, then froze. The movements felt right in a way nothing in his life had felt right before, like finding words in a language he'd always known, but never had the vocabulary to speak. The stallion took 1 step forward, just one, but it was enough. Marcus spent the morning in the pasture, moving through his silent vocabulary while the horses watched and occasionally responded. A step forward here, an ear swivel there, the gradual relaxation of muscles held tense against anticipated violence. By the time grandfather's truck rumbled back up the drive, 3 of the younger Mustangs had approached within 10 feet of Marcus, close enough that he could see the copper flecks in their eyes. Grandfather stood at the fence for a long time, watching his grandson stand motionless among animals that had kicked and bitten every handler who'd tried to touch them. He didn't call out, didn't interrupt, just watched until Marcus finally noticed him and walked back through the tall grass toward the fence. "What were you doing out there?" Marcus couldn't answer with words, so he showed grandfather the gestures, the specific angle of his arm. That meant approach, the rotation of his wrist that meant safety, the tilt of his head that the stallion had mirrored back to him. Grandfather studied the movements with the serious attention of someone who'd spent his life reading animals. "That's not any training method I've seen. You making this up?" Marcus nodded. "And they're responding to it?" Another nod. Grandfather looked back at the Mustangs, now grazing peacefully in the far corner of the pasture, and something shifted in his weathered face. Not quite hope, not yet. But maybe the shadow of possibility. "Show me again," he said. Slower this time. The days developed a rhythm that had nothing to do with clocks or schedules, and everything to do with the sun's arc across the wide Montana sky. Marcus rose with first light, moved through the pasture with his silent language, returned to the house only when grandfather called him in for meals. The old man had stopped trying to make conversation, recognizing that silence could be a form of communication more honest than most words. The Mustangs began to respond not just to Marcus's gestures, but to his presence. The buckskin stallion, Marcus had started thinking of him as leader, though he'd never name him aloud, would approach within arm's reach now, nostrils flaring as he tested the boy's scent, reading intentions written in breath and sweat, and the steady calm of someone who asked for nothing except to be understood. By the second week, Marcus had developed a vocabulary of movements so precise that grandfather started writing them down in an old notebook, sketching stick figures with arrows showing direction and flow. The gestures meant different things in different contexts. A raised palm could mean stop or could mean come, depending on the angle and the speed of the movement, on whether Marcus's weight shifted forward or back. "It's like you're dancing with them," grandfather observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the herd settle for the night. "But they're leading half the time, and you're following." Marcus had never thought of it that way, but grandfather was right. The communication flowed both directions. Leader would paw the ground in a specific pattern, and Marcus would mirror it. And suddenly 3 other horses would shift position in response. A mare would toss her head at a particular angle, and Marcus would raise his arm to match, and the whole herd would wheel left as though pulled by invisible strings. They were teaching each other a language nobody else could speak. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when the late summer heat pressed down on the plateau like a physical weight. Marcus was working with 4 of the younger horses, guiding them through a pattern of movements, circles within circles, approach and retreat, the precise geometry of trust being built one gesture at a time. He raised both arms above his head and brought them down in a sweeping arc. The 4 horses responded by moving, inward, tightening their circle. He shifted his weight to his left foot and extended his right arm. They mirrored the movement, the entire group pivoting as one organism. He dropped into a crouch, and they lowered their heads in perfect synchronization. Then he stood and swept his arms wide, and they exploded outward in a star pattern before wheeling back to reform their tight circle around him. Perfect precision, perfect trust, perfect communication without a single word spoken. Grandfather had been watching from the fence, but now he climbed through and walked slowly across the pasture. The horses, which would have spooked and run from his approach a week ago, simply watched him come. Leader stepped between Marcus and grandfather, not aggressive, just protective, and grandfather stopped a respectful distance away. "People need to see this," he said quietly. "This is something people need to see." The letter arrived on a Saturday, forwarded from the county extension office where grandfather had sent a shaky phone camera video of Marcus working with the horses. The envelope bore the seal of the United States Olympic Committee, and inside was an invitation written on heavy paper that felt important in a way Marcus couldn't quite name. "Says here they want to send someone to observe," Grandfather read aloud, his voice careful and slow. "Olympic equestrian coach, woman named Catherine Wells. She's apparently heard about the boy who talks to wild horses and wants to see if there's anything to it." He looked at Marcus over the top of the letter. "You want to do this? You don't have to. We can tell them no." But Marcus was already nodding, not because he understood what the Olympics were or why they mattered, but because he understood that the horses deserved to be seen, deserved to have their intelligence and capacity for communication recognized by people who had written them off as untrainable and worthless. Catherine Wells arrived 3 days later in a rental SUV that looked absurdly clean against the dusty ranch backdrop. She was younger than Grandfather expected, maybe 40, with close-cropped dark hair and the lean, muscled frame of someone who'd spent her life working with horses. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp and assessing, as they took in the modest ranch and the wild herd grazing in the distance. "I've trained horses for 30 years, she said without preamble. "Classical dressage, show jumping, cross-country eventing. I thought I'd seen every training method that existed. But what's in that video?" She shook her head. "I need to see it in person." Marcus led her to the pasture fence. The Mustangs had scattered to the far end when the strange vehicle arrived, but Leader stood his ground, watching the newcomer with eyes that missed nothing. Catherine leaned against the fence rails and waited, understanding without being told that this required patience. Marcus climbed through the fence and walked into the pasture. The morning sun caught the dust rising from his boots, turning the air golden and thick. He stopped 30 feet from the herd and began to move. The gestures flowed like water, like music, like poetry written in the air with hands and arms and the careful positioning of a body that had learned to speak volumes without making a sound. Marcus raised his right arm and swept it across his chest. Leader's ears pricked forward. Marcus shifted his weight and lowered into a crouch. 3 younger horses moved toward him, curious and cautious. He stood slowly and extended both arms to his sides, palms down. The 3 horses spread out, forming a line. He brought his hands together above his head, and they compressed their line, moving closer to each other. He stepped back twice and gestured to his left, and they wheeled as one, a perfect pivot that would have taken months to train using conventional methods. Then Marcus did something he'd been working on for the past week. He brought both hands to his chest and then pushed them outward in a circular motion. The 3 horses began to canter in a circle around him, not being chased or driven, but moving of their own volition, responding to a request rather than a command. He varied the gesture, speeding and slowing the movement of his hands, and the horses matched the rhythm perfectly, their hoofbeats synchronized like a drum beat echoing across the plateau. Catherine Wells stood at the fence with her mouth open, all professional composure forgotten. She watched Marcus bring the horses to a stop with a simple lowering of his hands, watched them approach him to nuzzle his shoulders and accept the gentle touch he offered, watched a mute 8-year-old boy accomplish something she'd never seen in 3 decades of professional horse training. "How long have you been working with him?" she asked Grandfather, her voice tight with emotion. 3 weeks, just 3 weeks. Catherine was silent for a long moment, watching Marcus walk back toward them, with Leader following a few steps behind like a devoted friend. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, weighted with understanding of what she was witnessing. "That's not training, that's communication, true 2-way communication. And if we could teach this method to riders..." She trailed off, the implications too enormous to fully articulate. "Would you let me work with Marcus? Would you let me document this and share it with the Olympic training program?" Grandfather looked at Marcus, the question clear in his eyes. This was bigger than the ranch, bigger than Grandfather's quiet life and Marcus's silent world. This was something that could change everything, for better or worse. Marcus thought about the horses, about Leader and the others who'd been labeled wild and untrainable, who'd been hours away from being shipped to slaughter because nobody could understand what they were trying to say. He thought about all the other horses in the world who might be misunderstood, mistreated, discarded because humans didn't know how to listen. He nodded once, decisive and clear. Catherine smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Then let's make history." The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. Catherine returned to the ranch 3 days later with a film crew, proper release forms, and a stack of books on equine behavior that she insisted grandfather read, even though he claimed he was too old to learn new tricks. She set up cameras around the pasture and spent 2 weeks documenting every gesture, every response, every nuanced interaction between Marcus and the Mustangs. But she didn't just observe, she learned. Catherine was a gifted horsewoman with decades of experience, but watching her try to replicate Marcus's movements was like watching someone try to speak a foreign language from a textbook. The gestures were technically correct, but they lacked the fluency, the musicality, the ineffable quality that made Marcus's communication feel like conversation rather than command. "You're thinking too much," grandfather told her one afternoon, as she struggled to get even one horse to respond to her raised palm gesture. "Marcus doesn't think about it, he feels it. I've trained my whole life to think precisely about every movement," Catherine said, frustration creeping into her voice. "How do I unlearn that?" Marcus, listening to this exchange, walked over and took Catherine's hand. He guided it through the gesture slowly, showing her not just the movement, but the rhythm, the weight, the subtle shift of intention that transformed a physical action into communication. He placed her hand on Leader's neck and showed her how to feel the horse's heartbeat, how to match her breath to his, how to create synchronization at a level deeper than visual cues. Catherine tried again, this time with her eyes closed, moving by feel rather than sight. Leader's ear flicked toward her, not a full response, but acknowledgement. Progress. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, I see." The video Catherine uploaded to the Olympic Training Committee's private server went viral within the equestrian community almost immediately. Coaches from around the world reached out, skeptical and curious in equal measure. The U.S. Olympic equestrian team, struggling after 2 decades without a gold medal, invited Marcus and Catherine to their training facility in Virginia. The invitation came with first-class plane tickets, hotel accommodations, and a consulting fee that made grandfather's hands shake when he read the number. Marcus had never been on a plane, had never been east of Montana, had never imagined that his silent conversations with wild horses could lead to something like this. "You don't have to go," grandfather said, though his eyes said otherwise. "This is a lot to ask of a boy your age." But Marcus was already packing the small duffel bag that held everything he owned, not because he cared about the Olympics or fame or money, but because, somewhere in Virginia, there were horses who needed someone to understand them, and he'd learned that understanding was a gift you shared, not hoarded. The Olympic training facility was overwhelming in its scope and sophistication. Pristine stables, immaculate riding arenas, horses worth more than most houses. The athletes training there moved with the precision of machines. Their riding technically perfect, but somehow lacking the quality Marcus had developed with his wild Mustangs. They rode horses. Marcus communicated with them. The difference was subtle, but fundamental. Catherine introduced Marcus to the team captain, a woman named Jennifer Chen, who'd competed in 2 Olympics without medaling and was running out of chances. Her horse, a massive Dutch warmblood named Thunder, was talented but temperamental, prone to refusing jumps and breaking rhythm at crucial moments. "I've worked with the best trainers in the world," Jennifer said, her voice edged with the particular frustration of someone who'd tried everything and failed. "What makes you think a mute 8-year-old can help me?" Marcus didn't react to the skepticism. He simply walked to Thunder's stall and stood outside it, studying the horse with the intense focus he'd learned from 3 months of patient observation. Thunder paced inside the stall, restless and anxious, his energy contained, but barely. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a carrot, not to feed to Thunder, but to hold in his palm while he breathed slowly and deeply, letting his heartbeat settle into a calm, steady rhythm. Thunder stopped pacing and approached the stall door, curious about this small human who asked for nothing and radiated quiet confidence. Then Marcus began the gestures. Not the training movements he'd developed for the Mustangs, but something new, communication tailored specifically to Thunder's energy and temperament. Quick, decisive movements that matched the horse's own impatience, gradually slowing and softening until Thunder's breathing synchronized with Marcus's and the anxiety visible in every line of the horse's body began to ease. Jennifer watched this transformation with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was being reconstructed in real time. "How was he doing that?" "He's listening," Catherine said quietly. "Really listening. And because he's listening, Thunder's listening back." Over the next 3 months, Marcus worked with every horse and rider on the Olympic team, developing customized gesture languages that bridge the gap between human intention and equine understanding. He taught the riders to feel rather than control, to communicate rather than command, to build partnerships with their horses that went deeper than training, and touched something fundamental about trust and mutual respect. The changes were remarkable. Horses that had been labeled difficult became cooperative. Riders who'd plateaued in their development suddenly broke through to new levels of performance. The team that had been fragmented and frustrated cohered into something that looked, from the outside, almost magical in its synchronization. And at the center of it all was a mute boy from Montana who'd never wanted anything except to understand and be understood. The Olympics arrived like a storm that had been building for months. All the preparation, all the training, all the hope and fear compressed into 2 weeks of competition that would determine whether Marcus's revolutionary method was legitimate or just a temporary fluke that would fade under pressure. The equestrian events were held in a massive stadium complex that made Marcus dizzy with its scale and noise. Thousands of spectators, cameras everywhere. Pressure that would have crushed someone with less focus and more concern for outcomes beyond the immediate moment. But Marcus had learned long ago how to live in silence while chaos raged around him. He stayed centered, stayed present, stayed focused on the only thing that mattered, helping the horses and riders communicate clearly in moments when everything else tried to pull them apart. Jennifer and Thunder were competing in the individual show jumping event, one of the most technically demanding disciplines in equestrian sport. One rail down, one refusal, one broken rhythm, and the gold medal would slip away. Thunder was talented enough to win, but his temperamental nature had always been his downfall under pressure. Marcus stood at the arena entrance with Jennifer, Thunder already saddled and ready. The horse was tense, picking up on the crowd's energy, on Jennifer's nervous anticipation, on the weight of expectation that pressed down from all sides. His ears lay back, his muscles quivered, and Marcus could see the refusal building before anyone else recognized it. He stepped forward and placed one hand on Thunder's neck, just above his heartbeat, closed his eyes and breathed slowly, deeply, until his own heartbeat matched Thunder's. Then he began the gesture sequence they'd developed together, small, precise movements that looked like nothing to observers, but meant everything to the horse who'd learned to read them as clearly as words. Peace, trust, partnership. We do this together. Thunder's ears came forward, his breathing steadied. The tension in his muscles eased from fight or flight to focused readiness. Jennifer looked down at Marcus with eyes that held gratitude and understanding. She'd learned the gesture language too, could speak to Thunder in this silent vocabulary that transcended traditional writing cues. She nodded once to Marcus, then guided Thunder into the arena. The course was brutal, 15 jumps set at Olympic height and width, combinations that required split-second timing, technical elements that separated the great riders from the merely good. Jennifer and Thunder moved through it like water flowing downhill, finding the natural path through difficulty, responding to each other with the kind of seamless communication that Marcus had spent 3 months teaching them. Perfect round, clear, no faults. The crowd erupted, but Marcus barely heard them. He was watching the way Jennifer leaned forward to hug Thunder's neck, the way the horse curved his head back toward her, the perfect circle of communication and appreciation they'd created together. 3 more riders completed the competition with similar success, all trained using Marcus's methods, all moving with their horses in that distinctive flowing synchronization that looked effortless but required profound mutual understanding. When the final scores were tallied, the U.S. Olympic equestrian team had swept the individual medals and won the team gold for the first time in 20 years. The medal ceremony was televised globally. Catherine accepted the coaching award, but in her speech, she did something unexpected. She invited Marcus to join her on the podium, gestured for him to stand beside her, while cameras flashed and the crowd cheered. And then she explained in clear and simple terms how a mute 8-year-old boy had revolutionized Olympic equestrian training by learning to listen to horses in a language nobody else knew existed. Marcus can't speak with his voice, Catherine said into the microphone, her words carrying to millions watching around the world. but he speaks volumes through his actions, his patience, and his profound understanding that communication isn't about forcing others to understand you. It's about putting in the work to understand them. These gold medals don't belong to the riders or the coaches or even the horses. They belong to the boy who taught us all how to listen. The crowd's applause was deafening, but Marcus wasn't paying attention to the noise or the cameras or the medals being placed around the athletes' necks. He was watching Thunder, standing calmly at the arena entrance with one ear cocked toward the podium, and seeing in the horse's relaxed posture the confirmation that mattered most. They understood each other, and that understanding had changed everything. The aftermath of Olympic gold came in waves that threatened to drown the quiet life Marcus had known. Media requests, book deals, invitations to speak at conferences until someone pointed out he couldn't speak, and the invitations transformed into requests for demonstrations. Everyone wanted a piece of the boy who talked to horses, wanted to package and sell and profit from the method he'd developed in 3 months of silent mornings on a failing Montana ranch. Grandfather fielded most of the requests with the same gruff efficiency he applied to everything else in life. No to reality TV shows. No to endorsement deals. No to anyone who wanted to exploit Marcus's gift rather than learn from it. But yes to the universities that wanted to study his methods. Yes to the therapy programs that thought his techniques could help children with autism or other communication disorders. Yes to anything that honored the core principle that communication built through understanding created transformation that commands never could. They returned to the Montana ranch on a cold October morning, the landscape already touched by early snow that turned the plateau into something crystalline and otherworldly. The Mustangs were still there, grazing in the pasture where Marcus had first learned to speak without words. Leader raised his head as the truck pulled up, recognition clear in the way he immediately trotted toward the fence. Marcus climbed out before Grandfather had even parked and ran to the fence rails, his arms already moving through the greeting sequence he'd developed. Leader responded in kind, specific movements of head and hooves that meant welcome, that meant I remember, that meant you came back. Thought we might lose you to the bright lights, Grandfather said, coming to stand beside Marcus at the fence. Thought you might decide that Olympic champions and fancy training facilities were more interesting than a broken-down ranch and a handful of unwanted horses. Marcus shook his head firmly and signed the gesture that meant home, the one that meant here, the one that meant this is where I belong. Grandfather's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile or might have been the sun in his eyes. Good. Because I've been getting calls from the Bureau of Land Management. Seems they've got another roundup of wild Mustangs coming in, hundreds of them, all supposedly untrainable, all headed for slaughter if someone doesn't take them. He looked at Marcus with eyes that held a question and a challenge. Thought maybe we could build something here, not just a ranch, but a training center, a place where horses nobody wants can learn to communicate with people who actually care to listen. A place where that method you developed doesn't get commercialized and commodified, but gets used the way it was meant to be used, to build understanding between species, not profit for corporations. Marcus understood what Grandfather was really asking. This would be hard work, endless work, taking in horses that others had given up on, developing individualized communication systems for each one, training handlers who could learn to listen rather than control. It would mean giving up opportunities for wealth and fame, choosing instead the difficult and often thankless labor of transformation that happened one horse, one gesture, one moment of understanding at a time. It would mean choosing silence over noise, depth over breadth, meaning over money. Marcus signed yes with his whole body, the gesture so clear and decisive that Leader whinnied in response. The training center took shape slowly over the next 2 years. Grandfather sold off half the ranch to fund construction, a new barn, proper training arenas, living quarters for the handlers who came from around the world to study with Marcus. The Bureau of Land Management provided a steady stream of wild Mustangs that everyone else had written off as impossible to train, but Marcus proved over and over that untrainable simply meant misunderstood. He worked with each horse individually, developing custom gesture languages that spoke to their specific temperaments and histories. Some horses needed large, dramatic movements to match their big personalities. Others required subtle, minimal gestures that respected their nervousness and fear. No two systems were exactly alike, because no two horses were exactly the same. The handlers who came to learn, professional trainers, Olympic hopefuls, therapeutic riding instructors, had to unlearn almost everything they thought they knew about horse training. They had to let go of control and embrace partnership, had to stop thinking about horses as animals to be dominated and start seeing them as individuals to be understood. Many couldn't make the shift. Their egos, or their conditioning, or their simple impatience prevented them from developing the patience and humility that Marcus's method required. But those who could make the shift discovered something profound. They discovered that the communication skills they learned with horses transferred to every other relationship in their lives. That learning to listen, really listen, without the noise of their own expectations and assumptions, made them better partners, better parents, better humans. Catherine became the center's first permanent instructor, leaving her Olympic coaching position to dedicate herself fully to teaching Marcus's methods. She'd been changed by her time working with him, had discovered that technical perfection meant nothing without emotional connection, that all her years of traditional training had taught her how to control horses, but not how to communicate with them. "You gave me back something I'd lost," she told Marcus one evening, as they watched a new group of handlers work through their first clumsy attempts at gesture-based communication. "You reminded me why I fell in love with horses in the first place, not because they're beautiful or powerful or capable of winning medals, but because they're honest. They don't lie. They don't manipulate. They respond to authenticity with authenticity, and everything else is just noise." Marcus signed the gesture that meant teacher, but he pointed it back at Catherine, then at the horses, then at grandfather. Everyone teaches. Everyone learns. That was the foundation of his method, the understanding that communication was a circle, not a hierarchy, and wisdom flowed in all directions to those humble enough to receive it. On Marcus's 13th birthday, the training center hosted its first international symposium. Equestrian professionals from 23 countries gathered to observe demonstrations, attend workshops, and learn the fundamentals of gesture-based horse communication. The event was covered by major news outlets, featured in documentaries, discussed in academic papers that tried to quantify and categorize something that resisted easy measurement. But for Marcus, the most important moment came not during the official programming, but in a quiet conversation with a woman who traveled from Argentina with her 10-year-old daughter. The daughter, Christina, had been born with cerebral palsy that affected her speech and fine motor control. Doctors said she'd never walk without assistance, never live independently, never communicate beyond basic needs. But Christina loved horses with the fierce passion of someone who recognized kindred spirits, creatures whose intelligence and capacity for communication existed independent of verbal language. "My daughter's therapists say working with animals helps with motor skills," the mother explained through a translator, though her eyes said this was about something deeper than physical therapy. "But I watched your video and I thought, maybe Marcus could teach her more than therapy. Maybe he could teach her to communicate." Marcus had learned enough English now to understand most of the conversation, though he still couldn't speak it. He gestured for Christina to follow him to the training arena, where a gentle mare named Whisper waited. Whisper had been rescued from a hoarding situation, so traumatized by neglect that she flinched from touch and spooked at sudden movements. Marcus had spent 6 months developing a gesture vocabulary that respected her boundaries while slowly building her confidence. He showed Christina the basic gestures, slow, sweeping movements that her affected muscles could manage with effort. Not the precise, controlled movements that Catherine and other professional handlers had learned, but broader, more expressive gestures that matched Christina's own physical vocabulary. He showed her how Whisper responded not to perfection, but to intention, to the authentic effort to communicate, regardless of whether the gestures were technically correct. Christina raised one arm in a sweeping arc, her movement jerky and uncontrolled. Whisper's ear flicked toward her. Christina tried again, better this time, and Whisper took one step forward. The girl's face transformed with joy so pure it made everyone watching fall silent. For the next hour, Marcus worked with Christina, adapting his methods to her abilities, showing her that communication wasn't about perfect execution, but about authentic intention. He showed her that Whisper didn't care about her disability or her limitations. The horse only cared about whether Christina was genuinely trying to understand and be understood. By the end of the session, Christina had successfully guided Whisper through a simple sequence of movements using adapted gestures that worked within her physical constraints. The accomplishment was modest by objective standards, but the transformation in Christina's confidence, in her sense of capability and agency, was extraordinary. "You didn't just teach her how to work with horses," her mother said, tears streaming down her face. "You taught her that she has a voice, that she can be understood, that her way of communicating isn't wrong, just different." That night, Marcus lay in bed thinking about Christina and about all the other people in the world who felt silenced or misunderstood or incapable of making themselves heard. He thought about how his own muteness had been seen as a disability, a limitation, something to be fixed or worked around. But his silence had actually been his greatest gift. It had forced him to develop other ways of communicating, to pay attention to the subtle languages spoken by gesture and posture and the thousand small movements that conveyed meaning beyond words. What if his method wasn't just about training horses? What if it was about teaching a different kind of literacy, the ability to read and speak the languages that existed in silence, in movement, in the space between intention and action? The training center evolved to include programs for children with communication disorders, for adults recovering from strokes or traumatic brain injuries, for anyone whose relationship with verbal language had been disrupted or had never developed. They came to learn horse handling, but discovered something more fundamental: that communication was possible even when traditional language failed. That understanding could be built through patient attention and mutual effort. That silence could be eloquent when you learn to listen properly. Marcus trained a new generation of instructors in his adapted methods, each one specializing in working with different populations and needs. The techniques continued to evolve, becoming more nuanced and sophisticated as Marcus himself matured and gained deeper understanding of the principles underlying his original instinctive approach. At 17, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. His father, whom he hadn't seen since that dusty afternoon when he'd been dropped off at grandfather's ranch 9 years earlier, showed up at the training center in a rental car, looking older and smaller than Marcus remembered. They stood awkwardly in the ranch office, grandfather scowling from behind his desk, while Marcus's father struggled to find words for a conversation that was 9 years overdue. "I've been following your success," his father finally said. "Seen you on TV, read about the Olympic gold, the training center, all of it. I wanted to come sooner, but I didn't know what to say to you. Didn't know how to apologize for leaving you here, for choosing the divorce and the fighting over being your father." Marcus waited, his face neutral, giving nothing away. "Your mother and I got remarried," his father continued. "Different people, both of us. We're living in Denver now. We have a new family, twin girls, 3 years old. And every time I look at them, I think about you. About the son I abandoned because I was 2. Wrapped up in my own pain to see what you needed." He paused, struggling with emotion. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you, proud of who you've become. And I wanted to ask, would you be willing to meet your sisters? Would you be willing to let me try to be your father again, even though I failed at it the first time?" Marcus looked at this man who'd given him life and then walked away from it. He felt the old anger, yes, the old hurt. But he'd spent 9 years learning that holding on to pain didn't heal it. Only understanding and communication could do that. And communication required both parties to be willing to try. He signed a gesture that meant yes, then added another that meant but slowly. His father wouldn't understand the movements, but grandfather translated, and the relief on his father's face was genuine enough that Marcus believed the apology might be too. They built a relationship slowly over the next several years, visits that gradually increased in frequency and duration, phone calls where Marcus typed responses and his father read them aloud, family gatherings where his half-sisters learned that Uncle Marcus didn't talk with his voice, but had plenty to say through his hands and eyes, and the patient attention he gave to their constant questions. It wasn't perfect. There was too much history, too much damage to fully repair, but it was real, and it was honest, and it proved that communication could bridge even the gaps created by years of silence and abandonment. Meanwhile, the training center thrived. The methods Marcus had developed were now taught at universities, incorporated into therapeutic writing programs worldwide. studied by researchers trying to understand the neurological and psychological mechanisms that made his approach so effective. Several of his former students had gone on to Olympic success of their own, winning medals while crediting Marcus's techniques for transforming their relationships with their horses. But Marcus himself never competed, never sought the spotlight. He remained at the Montana ranch, working with the horses nobody else wanted, teaching the handlers who came from around the world, seeking to learn his methods. He'd been offered millions to commercialize his techniques, to franchise the training center, to turn his gift into an empire. He'd refused every offer, because what he'd discovered in that pasture at age 8 wasn't a commodity to be sold. It was a principle to be shared. Communication built through understanding created transformation that commands never could. That principle worked with horses. It worked with humans. It worked across every boundary and barrier that seemed insurmountable until someone had the patience and humility to actually listen. On a spring morning, 20 years after Marcus first stepped into that pasture of wild mustangs, he stood at the fence watching a new generation of horses arrive. 50 of them, rounded up from federal lands, all deemed untrainable and destined for slaughter until the Bureau of Land Management contacted the training center for one last intervention. Grandfather had died 2 years earlier, peacefully in his sleep, leaving the ranch in the center to Marcus with a letter that said simply, "You turn my failure into something beautiful. Keep building on it." Leader was still alive, though barely. 28 years old now, grayed and slow, but still the undisputed patriarch of the training center's resident herd. He stood beside Marcus at the fence, the two of them watching the new arrivals with the practiced eye of those who'd seen this scene hundreds of times before. Catherine approached from the barn, leading a young handler named James, who'd come from inner-city Baltimore with no horse experience, but an intuitive understanding of the principles underlying Marcus's methods. James was deaf, communicated in ASL, and had recognized immediately that Marcus's gesture system shared fundamental similarities with sign language. Both were visual vocabularies that conveyed complex meaning through movement and space. "Ready?" Catherine signed to Marcus, her ASL now fluent after years of working with handlers from diverse communication backgrounds. Marcus nodded and climbed through the fence rails. 20 years of practice had refined his gestures, but not fundamentally changed them. He still moved with the same intuitive grace, the same patient attention to subtle responses, the same profound respect for the intelligence and dignity of the horses he worked with. The new arrivals scattered as he approached, fear and wariness written in every line of their bodies. But Marcus had learned that fear was just a form of communication, a language spoken by those who'd been hurt and needed reassurance that this time would be different. He began to move, his gestures slow and deliberate, speaking in the universal vocabulary of peace and patience and genuine effort to understand. One by one, the horses stopped running. Ears flickered forward. Heads turned to watch this strange human who spoke without sound, but communicated volumes through the careful choreography of movement and space. A young stallion, black coat, white star on his forehead, eyes that held the same wild intelligence Leader had possessed 20 years earlier, separated from the herd and approached cautiously, testing, questioning, deciding whether this human could be trusted. Marcus extended one hand, palm down, and waited. The stallion sniffed his fingers, reading intention through scent and stillness. Then, slowly, deliberately, the stallion lowered his head in a gesture Marcus recognized from 2 decades of interspecies conversation. "Hello, I see you. I'm willing to try." Marcus signed back with movement the stallion would understand. "And I see you, and I'll earn your trust, however long it takes." From the fence, James watched with the hungry attention of someone, recognizing their own future taking shape. Catherine placed a hand on his shoulder and signed, "That could be you someday, if you're willing to put in the work." James signed back, "I'm willing." The sun climbed higher over the Montana plateau, burning away the morning mist and revealing the landscape in all its stark beauty. The training center spread across what had been Grandfather's failing ranch, transformed into something that honored both the land's history and its future. Barns and arenas, pastures full of horses learning to trust again, handlers from around the world learning that communication transcended language, that understanding bridged every gap, That silence could speak volumes to those patient enough to listen. Marcus stood in the pasture surrounded by 50 wild horses who were learning he could be trusted, flanked by Leader, who'd been his first teacher, watched by students who would carry his methods into futures he'd never see, building on foundations he'd laid when he was just 8 years old and desperate to be understood. He'd never spoken a word aloud, never would. But he'd created a language that thousands now spoke, that had changed Olympic training and therapeutic practice and the fundamental way humans understood their relationships with other species. He'd proven that communication required neither voice nor words, only authentic intention and patient attention to what the other was trying to say. The young black stallion took a step closer, then another, until he stood within arm's reach. Marcus raised his hand slowly and rested it against the horse's neck, feeling the heartbeat beneath skin and muscle, synchronizing his breathing until boy and horse moved in perfect rhythm. In that moment, in that silence, in that perfect understanding built through patience and mutual respect, history wasn't being made. It was simply being lived, one gesture, one heartbeat, one profound connection at a time. And that, Marcus had learned over 20 years of silent conversation, was how you change the world, not through grand declarations or revolutionary manifestos, but through the patient accumulation of moments when you chose understanding over control, communication over command, partnership over dominance. The wild horses would be tamed, not broken, but understood. The handlers would be trained, not just in technique, but in the deeper principle that all meaningful communication began with listening. And somewhere in the future, another child who couldn't speak or couldn't hear or couldn't fit into the narrow definitions of normal would find their way to this ranch and discover that their difference wasn't a disability, but a different kind of gift. Leader nickered softly, a sound of approval and contentment. Marcus rested his other hand on the old horse's shoulder, connecting past and present, honoring the bond that had started everything. 20 years, thousands of horses, hundreds of students, countless lives changed, and all of it had begun with a mute boy and a herd of wild mustangs learning to speak the same language, the universal grammar of patience, respect, and the profound belief that every creature deserved to be understood on their own terms rather than forced to conform to someone else's expectations. The sun continued its arc across the endless Montana sky, and Marcus continued his silent work, and the horses continued their eternal dance between wildness and trust. Some stories, Marcus had learned, didn't need words to be told. They just needed someone willing to listen.